Jesus is our King, the once, present, and future King. Given our readings for today, that might not mean exactly what we think it means when the word king hits our ears. This could be that many of us have received our notions of what a king is from the hit movie, The Lion King, where we learn that a king means no one saying do this, no one saying be there, no one saying stop that, no one saying see here. I just can't wait to be king. So, and if we're honest, this is the image that comes to our mind, and this is how a lot of people treat power. It means nobody can tell me what to do. I am the king. I am in charge here. The king is in control of everything and everyone, and there's nothing that anyone can do about it. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but the problem is people aren't that great. We are selfish. We are prideful. And when we have too much power, it usually crushes us. That's what happens. It brings out the worst in us. We see it time and time again, and we see it in our own church as well. Power given to people before their character is ready to bear the weight of it will crush you, and the domino effect will ruin people's lives. It happens time and time again. We see it all the time. But today is Christ the King Sunday. It's a relatively new feast in the life of the church. It was introduced by the Catholics in 1925. 1925, not 1025, 1925. In the aftermath of World War I, Pope Pius sought to minister to a world wounded by war. And so he introduced a new feast day called Christ the King as a reminder that Jesus is our ultimate authority. Jesus is the one whom every knee will bow, every tongue will confess is Lord. And it's supposed to remind us that our obedience and our reverence is to be to Jesus in our public affairs. And so the background of this feast is fascism is rising in Europe. Mussolini was the prime minister in Italy at the time, and Hitler is gaining prominence and popularity in Germany. And so in the face of these massive governmental movements that will change the course of history and shape the world that we live in today, in those massive movements, the church sought to remind us who is king, who is the one who has ultimate authority, and who before whose throne we will stand and we will have to receive judgment before. And so this feast is now celebrated in many major denominations. It's not just a Catholic feast anymore. The Episcopal Church included it in our 1979 prayer book. And it seems that the rise of this prominence, that this feast means something to so many people, shows that it's putting its finger on the pulse of something about our culture, something that we experience even today. I think partially there are two things that I noticed. First is that we are realizing that we have less and less control over our lives and over the world and our choices. I think about algorithms, the increased use of algorithms. We have become the product rather than the user. We don't really understand exactly how large language models and AI is going to affect the way that we think, the way that we interact with the world. We don't understand these things. Further, these major geopolitical movements in the world, they happen regardless of your opinion about them. And what we are seeing is we don't have control. We don't have control about these things. So we are realizing that more and more. Another thing is that people are really tired of hearing that everything is bad all the time. I know that I am. Headlines pretty much everywhere say something like, everything is worse than you can possibly imagine. There's nothing you can do about it. And that gets old. That gets really old. In the New York Times, just this last week, they posted an article that said, "We tire very quickly," this is the title, "we tire very quickly of being told everything is on fire." And so there's rampant fatalism. So we have this lack of control, and we have this fatalistic culture, and these things are kind of going on, and they're shaping us. And there's recently, Gen Z has been identified as the anxious generation, because they're raised in a culture that tells them you have no control and everything is on fire. And so I recognize that reality in myself. I recognize that reality in the world. They are at play. But the gospel of Jesus brings a message of hope into that. It brings hope to a fatalistic culture where people feel out of control. And the hope is that Jesus is our King. And that's what this feast day directs our attention to. And so what type of king is Jesus? Our readings for today paint a brilliant mosaic of Jesus' kingship. So let me set the scene. Tensions are rising when Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem for the Passover feast. The chief priests and authorities are seeking to undermine Jesus, trying to catch him in some sort of fallacy publicly because he is threatening their way of life, their livelihood. He's threatening the way that they interact with the world. And so there's this buzz in the air. There's this tension that's palpable. You can feel it. And the political and religious leaders are aware of the crowds and the risk of creating riots if they were to arrest Jesus as he's teaching in the public square and healing people. They realize that if they were to arrest him without any probable cause, that a riot would outbreak. And so as the Passover is taking place, the religious rulers, with the help of one of Jesus' followers, figure out where Jesus is going to be that night and plot to arrest him in the middle of the night when no one's around. So they do. And it happens in the garden. Jesus' followers basically scatter whenever this happens. And they take Jesus to the house of the chief priest for an impromptu trial. And this trial goes all through the night. And then they take Jesus from the high priest's house to Pilate, the Roman governor. And this is right early in the morning. And they ask Pilate to kill this man, to kill Jesus. And Pilate's like, whoa, what's going on? What did he do? And the Jewish leaders are like, well, it's against our law to kill him, so we can't do it, so we need you to do our dirty work for us. And so they've given no accusation at all. And so Pilate takes him in, and that's where our passage begins for today. So we're seeing Pilate's very first words to Jesus that we have recorded. And so I think that first question that Pilate asks is a fair one. I don't think he's being snarky just yet. He says, are you the king of the Jews? He had had some tensions, we know, in his political career with the Jewish leaders at the time. And so, I think he's just trying to get the whole story. But over the course of the conversation between Pilate and Jesus, it's very difficult to follow. It's almost like they're missing each other. And I think this is partially because the description of king almost shatters under the weight of Jesus' rule, under the weight of Jesus' reign. I think the metaphor is stretched almost to its breaking point, and we see that in the presence of an earthly king, Pilate, and Jesus, the God of the universe. And this is exasperated by the fact that Jesus is the one in chains before the earthly ruler. So being called a king, it almost shatters under the weight of that. And Jesus answers Pilate's question with his own question. Do you say that I'm a king, or did you hear that from somebody else? And Pilate answers with another question. This is the point where I'm like, John, couldn't you have just smoothed this out a little bit for us? Made the dialogue a little easier for us to follow. But I do think it's purposeful. So Jesus basically ignores Pilate's question. And he says, my kingdom is not from this world. If it were from this world, you would have just started a war. There would be violence. My followers would be preventing this from happening because that's what earthly kingdoms do. My kingdom is not from this world. Jesus talks a lot about the world in John's gospel. He uses the world as a catch-all term to describe the human condition under the power of sin. So the world is sinful humanity. We are the world. Cue Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie. We are the world. But the good news for us is that God so loved the world that he sent his only son. Jesus' kingdom is not from this world, but it is for this world. Jesus brings salvation into history. There are only three humans mentioned in the creed: Jesus, Mary, and Pilate. So Jesus and Mary make a lot of sense to me. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. We should have that in the creed. But Pilate doesn't make as much clear sense as Jesus and Mary. And I don't think it was just for fun. I don't think they just included that in there to slander Pilate every single week. But I think what it does is it anchors Jesus in history. This is a moment in time. Pontius Pilate was a ruler from 25 AD to 35 AD. He was a ruler in time and place. And remembering that in the creed, remembering that every single week, ties it down to a particular context. So not some ethereal, mythical story. We can't over-spiritualize it. It is physical. It happens in time because God enters time and space to save time and space. And so Jesus' salvation is for the world. It is for sinful humanity. It is for the world as it currently is. There's no sugarcoating events in the Bible. And sometimes, especially when I'm teaching a middle school Sunday school, I wish the authors of the Old Testament would have sugarcoated some things sometimes. But they don't, because that's how the world is. The pages of our history book capture this mess that we live in, this mess of rulers, this mess of history unfolding. And the pages of the Bible capture that mess too, but they insert something important about reality, is that God has entered the mess and God works out salvation in the world as it is. Jesus is in reality, not far off. He's here in reality. And 2,000 years ago, Jesus entered that reality. He gets right in the mess of it all, and he pulls us out of that mess. He overcomes the world. And that is exactly what Jesus does on the cross. It's exactly what he does after this conversation with Pilate. The cross is the culmination of the world's brokenness, and Jesus walks unflinchingly the path of the cross, carrying our sin, carrying our mess, and putting it to death for all time. He is victorious over it all. And we get a vibrant image of Jesus as the victorious king in our passage from Revelation. The passage opens up with praise for what Jesus has done. It says he loves us and has freed us from our sin by his blood. That's what our king does. That is what God does with unlimited power. He frees us. He pays for our sin. He atones for us and brings us into his love. So he frees us from sin, but not only that, he frees us for the kingdom. He makes us into a kingdom that is not from this world, but mediates God's love to this world. A kingdom of priests. We mediate God's love. We receive it and mediate it out into the world. And then he says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, who is, who was, and who is to come. Jesus is grounded in history. Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate, but his work is for all times and places. Jesus is the king who was, the one who went to the cross in Jerusalem under Pontius Pilate. And he is victorious over the great enemies of all of humanity on the cross. So Jesus is the one who was. He also is the one who is to come. He's the one who will unite all things in himself. And in the resurrection, he will raise us up for life in that eternal, perfected kingdom. But Jesus also is the one who is, the one who gathered us together this morning, the one who enters into our lives, into our histories, and is working out salvation among us. And so we don't just simply bide our time waiting for Jesus to fulfill all things. No, Jesus has come into your life, into my life, and is working salvation out in our very midst, close enough for us to grab onto. The kingdom of God is not from the world, but it is for the world, and we are made into that kingdom today, for the world as it is today. And we are invited to live as citizens of that unfolding kingdom now. So as citizens of that kingdom, we have hope. We have hope that the kingdoms, the governments, the corporations, the algorithms, all the things don't get the final say on our life. That the one who is and was and is to come, that is the one who gets the final say on our life. Jesus does. We have a hope that he's making all things right, knowing that Jesus is at work in our lives and our communities, drawing us deeper into his love today. And so watch for it. Look for it. Believe it, that Jesus is at work in your life, and open your eyes and see it. Listen for the Spirit. Feel the Spirit. Keep in step with the Spirit like a dance. Because he's there. And we have peace knowing that Jesus is here. We have peace knowing that. That when life feels out of control, Jesus is here with us. In the mess of our lives, whatever burdens you're carrying, Jesus is there and he carries them with you. He will not abandon us no matter how messy it gets. Jesus' kingdom is not from this world, but it is for this world. Jesus is the King who was, who is, and is to come. And his love overcomes the world, even now. Amen.